Bible is full of stories that we all know and love. But how well do we know them? The answer might surprise you. The Bible you thought you knew is going to dive deep into the exquisite details of the biblical stories that make them fascinating and transforming. In this week's podcast, we are going to deal with an oracle from Isaiah chapter 1. In this passage, the prophet rails against Sodom and Gomorrah, or, more precisely, against the rulers of Sodom and the people of Gomorrah. That's in verse 10. As is well known, Sodom and Gomorrah are notoriously known for being wicked beyond compare. Their evil is such that they are destroyed by God before one gets to the very middle of Genesis, the Bible's first book. In any culture that has been influenced by Christianity, Judaism, and the Bible, almost everyone is aware of the depths of sin into which these two cities have sunk. Naturally, wickedness on this scale cannot help but elicit prophetic denunciation such as we encounter in the first chapter of Isaiah. But wait a minute. Sodom and Gomorrah had been destroyed for centuries before this prophet was even born, at least according to the biblical timeline. What was the point in denouncing two cities that had long since paid the ultimate price for their egregious behavior? Plus, Isaiah was an Israelite prophet. His audience consisted of Israelites. Granted, the average Israelite might not have objected when a prophet rehearsed some other nation's or city's sins. Everyone agreed that Sodom and Gomorrah were bad news. A word like depravity had to be coined to describe these two cities. Still, the question remains, why is Isaiah so exercised about these two cities? By now, you have likely guessed that the prophet was not, as a matter of fact, interested in the past. He was vitally concerned with the present. Indeed, the prophet was gearing his remarks to Israel in its current state. To do this, the prophet audaciously compares present Israel with the ancient cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. No wonder most prophets did not get invited to parties. It is one thing to sermonize Israel about shortcomings. It's quite another to compare them to Sodom and Gomorrah. It does not take long for Isaiah to blow his cover. Once he begins to recite the people's failures, there is no mistaking that the prophet has Israel in mind. Not only does he compare his people with Sodom and Gomorrah, but he criticizes the very essence of Israelite worship. The prophet says that God does not want all the sacrifices that the people offer. It does not matter how good the sacrifices are, whether rams or fatted calves. God is not the least impressed with the blood spilled in these sacrifices. Isaiah is relentless in calling into question all of Israel's worship practices. When the people come into the Lord's courts, they end up trampling them, a way of saying that God is completely disrespected. That's in verse 12. Not only are Israel's offerings vain, that is, worth nothing, but other things, like burning incense, is called an abomination. Feast days and holy days God actually despises, verses 13 and 14. For that reason, you might as well not offer prayers, because God is not in the mood to listen. When the prophet in effect quotes God as saying that Israel's hands are full of blood, it is difficult to know whether Israel is being accused of being violent or this is the result of Israel's worship practices. Regardless, God is not happy. At this point, God, via the prophetic word, calls for a change of heart. Wash yourselves, not literally, but metaphorically. Clean yourselves up spiritually, religiously, morally, God demands. But before we deal with this dimension to God's remarks, we have to ask an obvious question. It has to do with Israel's religious practices. What is their original source? The obvious answer to that question puts this scathing oracle in a brand new light. The prophet is railing against Israel for offerings, sacrifices of various kinds, paying attention to a religion calendar of holy feasts and festivals, the burning of incense, and the like. But every one of those practices were commanded by the same God who has summoned Isaiah to denounce Israel. Even skimming the books of Leviticus and to an extent Deuteronomy demonstrates that these religious postures and gestures came straight from God. Why did God want Israel to practice their religion in this manner? The answer to that question is also not difficult to find. All these activities were designed as a way for Israel to respond to the grace of God. How had that grace been manifested? There are two events in Israel's story that are prominent for describing God's amazing grace. One involves the election of the ancestors, whose descendants in time would become Israel's fathers and mothers. Of course, I'm referring to stories featuring Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob, Leah, Rachel, and his two other wives, which resulted in the famous 12 sons who in turn would become the 12 tribes of Israel. Given how faithless, disbelieving, or disobedient these characters were at crucial times, it is easy to understand why this is a story of divine grace. These people were elected to be Israel's ancestors regardless of their behavior. The story even underscores the second story even underscores God's grace toward Israel in the famous story of the escape from Egypt after having been enslaved. This was, of course, the Exodus, which was narrated in the biblical book of that same name. There is a key verse that illustrates emphatically how all these commandments regarding worship practices, not to mention virtually every other area of life, were to be a response to God's grace. That verse is Exodus chapter 20, verse 2. In this verse, Israel's God makes a simple statement. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. Right after that, God issues the 10 Commandments, which do not need much introduction. Also, right after this statement come all the other specific laws that Israel is to use to guide its life. These laws are not articulated all in one place, but as the rest of Exodus, Numbers, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy unfolds, all the laws are eventually listed. It goes without saying that many of these instructions involve worship, including sacrifices, offerings, feast days, holy days, and a whole array of things that pertain to Israel's liturgical and ritual behaviors. All these commandments, not simply the 10 most famous ones, are either spoken by God, specifically, such as in the 10 Commandments, or spoken by Moses at God's insistence. All these behaviors were designed to help Israel know how to respond to God's graciousness. That brings us back to our original question, namely, if these practices came from God, why is God now using Isaiah to condemn such practices? The answer to that more onerous question may be found in the later section of the oracle in Isaiah chapter 1. In the verse where the prophet admonishes Israel, aka Sodom and Gomorrah, he goes in another direction. Quote, "Cease to do evil, learn to do good, seek justice, correct oppression, defend the fatherless, plead for the widow." Those are in verses 16 and 17. In other words, Israel's liturgical practices need to be matched with their ethical and religious practices. God did not elect Israel to demonstrate an odd sort of divine partiality. God did that so that Israel would become a light to the nations. Part of that light had to do with being just, being against any oppressive practices, and defending marginalized groups, represented in this case orphans and widows who had no means of economic or social support. In short, Israel was to be a community where justice was the norm, where economic compassion was a communal commitment, where oppression of any sort was eschewed, where the marginalized were considered family. If Israel violated those basic commitments, then the sacrifices, offerings, the burning of incense not only did not matter, but called attention to their hypocrisy and making their religion a mockery. That is why so many prophets made the same point as we encounter in Isaiah 1. The problem was not sacrifices, offerings, burning incense, or any other liturgical practice per se. The problem was doing this when their behavior was not only not justifiable, but reprehensible. Israel needed to get its act together. That's why, as the oracle moves forward, God calls the people to reason together in verse 18. Forgiveness and restoration are always possible. The choice is Israel's. They can either respond to God's grace by organizing their communal life in a manner that promotes justice, has nothing to do with oppression, and sees that the marginalized are cared for, or they can continue to do just the opposite and risk divine censure, if not judgment. No one likes to be confronted with stark choices, but that is the price for being the elect people of God. Being a light to the nations means that light should never be extinguished. But there is one more surprise in store when we read Isaiah 1. Typically, when Christians read the Old Testament, they think they are reading about someone else or the other. Israel is about them, not us. But is that true? Are Christians exempt from an oracle such as found in Isaiah 1? I hate to be a bearer of bad news, but comparing Israel to Sodom and Gomorrah is not the only stunning feature of this passage. This passage is equally relevant to Christians. After all, the Old Testament is the larger part, I might add, of Christian Scripture. Not only that, but Christians are part of Israel. We acknowledge Jesus as the Christ or Messiah. A Christ or Messiah, someone who has been anointed for a particular purpose, is Israel's Christ or Messiah, the Son of David in New Testament terms. Keep in mind that Jesus was condemned and died as the King of the Jews. Jews was just another way of saying Israelites in Jesus' time. In addition, Paul argued that people who followed and believed in Jesus had been either adopted into Israel as legitimate sons and daughters, or had been grafted into the olive tree that stood for Israel. That is why Israel is a figure for the church. As people who follow Jesus the Christ or Messiah, the King of the Jews, and who have been adopted into the Israelite family or grafted into the Israelite tree, there is no escaping Israel. There is no escaping Isaiah and his diatribe. Our worship patterns, regardless of what they are, need to be a response to God's grace. Also, our worship practices need to be accompanied by behaviors that are ultimately ethical, supportive of justice, not oppressive in any way, and always keep in mind the marginalized and their needs. Isaiah 1 is indeed part of Christian Scripture. Let me encourage you to go to my website, faspina.com. Let me know what your email is so that I can contact you when we are ready for the mini courses. As I mentioned, I am right now in training for figuring out how to do this, so you'll soon get an email from me to invite you to participate. At the same time, if you have a question that you'd like me to address in a future Q&A session, then email me at fspina106@gmail.com. Thank you. I want to thank you so very much for listening to The Bible You Thought You Knew. I have a question for you. Do you have a question or topic that you'd like me to cover on the podcast? If so, all you need to do is head over to Apple Podcasts and do two simple things. One, leave a rating and review telling me what you think of the podcast. Two, in that review, ask anything you want related to the Bible. That's all you have to do. Then, listen in to hear your question answered on a future episode. Join us next time on The Bible You Thought You Knew when we discuss Jesus' personal Bible. God bless.